Welcome to Session 5 of Awakened, John Wesley and the Methodist Movement. We have spent time in the previous sessions looking at John Wesley's life, his beliefs, the way he conveyed those beliefs. We've looked at basic theological tenets of grace, prevenient grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. In Session 4, we focused on doing life together, the significance of groups, not just today, but the roots we have in the significance of groups in Methodism. It's how Methodism was birthed. It's significant. In Session 5, what we look at is what's called means of grace. It's what Wesley called means of grace. We've heard of what means of grace are, the examples of, but maybe we have never heard the language means of grace. In Wesley's sermon, Means of Grace, he writes this: "By means of grace, I understand as outward signs, words, or actions ordained of God and appointed for this end, to be ordinary channels whereby He, God, might convey to men, preventing, justifying, and sanctifying grace." We hear grace come up again. In that sermon, Wesley specifically mentions prayer, searching Scripture, and the Lord's Prayer. He speaks of prayer being, whether you are praying individually or part of a congregation, that is a channel by the means of grace. Don't earn us grace. That's never the goal. Reading every book of the Bible doesn't earn us any more or less grace of God. Praying hours a day doesn't earn any or more or less grace from God. God's grace is just going to happen. It's out of His love for us. But what Wesley believed, and what my experience and other experiences of others, is that by engaging in prayer and Scripture and the Lord's Supper, that it helps us get a better idea of the significance of God's grace, the depths, examples, to engage in a relationship with Him. So it's a channel that we experience the grace, not that we earn the grace or get the grace. And in fact, sometimes we can make following Jesus about all these things to do on a checklist. That's not it. It's how to ensure that we are engaging in prayer and Scripture and the Lord's Prayer. As I mentioned about the general rules of the Methodist societies that were do no harm, do good, and uphold the ordinances, under that is public worship, preaching, fasting, and abstinence. We see that are other ways, other means of grace. Of these ways that we experience God's grace. It's not limited to this. We can experience God's grace in many ways. Think about it. How are you engaging in prayer? We bring this up a lot, prayer and reading Scripture. It's not because we want you to feel guilty if you're not engaging in prayer and Scripture. It's because that is one of the ways that we connect with God. Scripture says nothing can separate us from the love of God. And yet there are these, that's not an appropriate way to say it. And what we experience is through Scripture and prayer, we become more and more connected to God. Now, the Lord's Supper is one of two sacraments that we believe as Methodists. Those two sacraments are Holy Communion and baptism. Wesley defined sacraments as this: an outward sign of an inward grace. And we think about baptism, we believe in infant baptism. Our belief in infant baptism is rooted in prevenient grace. That we believe that God is at work in an infant, in a child. That God's grace, before we ever acknowledge Him, before we ever reach out to Him, God is at work in us. And we acknowledge that through baptism. That is an outward sign of an inward grace. We believe in infant baptism. We also do not believe as Methodists in rebaptism. That may or may not be new information to you. Rebaptism is seen as that God didn't get it right. We believe God got it right the first time. When I was baptized at 6 weeks old, God who loved me then loves me now. That has not changed. Obviously, I have grown in my understanding of God and my relationship with God, but that truth has remained. And also, it looks at that baptism is about what God is doing in us. It's this inward grace that we reflect outwardly. There are 3 ways that we baptize as Methodists. We sprinkle, we pour, and we do use immersion. All 3 of those are possible ways you can be baptized in the Methodist Church. We also have confirmation, which we don't see as a sacrament. What we see confirmation as, it's a confirming of our baptismal vows. If we are baptized as infants, our parents answer the question, and through confirmation, we make a public profession of faith. We acknowledge we believe this. We believe in God. We believe in Jesus. We believe in the salvation of Jesus Christ. And we outwardly profess that faith. That's what confirmation does for us. That is our first sacrament, baptism. Second sacrament is Holy Communion. We believe in an open table. We believe the table is an our table. You don't have to meet qualifications. You don't have to be a member of our church. You don't even have to be a Methodist to be able to partake in Holy Communion. It is what is called an open table. There are denominations that is a closed table, and that is, having grown up Lutheran, I know that was part of it. I couldn't take communion until I'd been confirmed. That was one of the qualifications for that. Wesley wrote a sermon about the duty of constant communion. He believed that we should take communion as often as we can. Nowhere in his writings does it say the first Sunday of the month. That is something that came along after Wesley. In fact, I'm not even sure where it came along. We use the bread and the juice, not bread and wine. There is a great story about the connection of Methodism and Welch's grape juice. I don't have time to go into it today, but it's worth Googling if you're interested. When we think about communion, we remember the words that Jesus spoke. You are to do this in remembrance of me. When we think of Holy Communion from a Methodist perspective, it isn't that we're remembering something that happened a long time ago. We go, oh, that's right, Jesus did this. No, it's this living belief in our living God, that the God of our salvation, Jesus Christ, that his body and blood, the bread and the juice. We don't believe in that the bread really becomes the body or the juice really becomes the blood. We don't believe in that. There are denominations that do believe that. For us, we believe in the mystery. We believe that every time we take Holy Communion, that we're engaging in this means of grace, we are engaging in this outward sign of this inward grace. Wesley believed in the significance of self-examination and confession as we came to the table. It was important, it still is important, that we confess our need for God's grace and we give thanks for the lengths he was willing to go on our behalf. The means of grace, prayer, scripture, the Last Supper, Holy Communion. Being engaged in these ways that don't earn us grace, but are a channel to experience God's grace. How are you doing? How are you engaging in the means of grace? May we never take it for granted. Use the questions to discuss in your group. Talk about the ways, like I gave the example of how I was raised in a different denominational tradition where baptism and communion may have been different. What about for you? How is it that you see the sacraments? What kinds of questions do you have? We are hoping that this time together in conversation about Wesleyan Methodism helps us understand, learn more, and have conversations about the roots that we have and what it means for us today. Also, be sure to spend time in the scripture as the study guide outlines as we look at Acts 2, 42 through 47. I want you to look at the actions of the early church and how those are reflected in the means of grace. And then in Luke 22, we have the scripture of the Last Supper. May we be awakened to the means of grace and the significance of the sacraments in our life.